morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you so much for coming to our first GW Students for One Health event of the school year. So, as you may know, One Health Day is internationally recognized as being on November 3rd, and we thought we would celebrate with a distinguished panel of speakers today. Before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to acknowledge the e-board members that have made this event possible, as well as give a bit of background information on One Health. So my name is Yusra Ahmed, and I'm the president of GW Students for One Health. Our vice president is Ritika Papacharia. Our treasurer is Sanika Kulkarni, who is currently standing upstairs directing people down. Our treasurer is Sanika Kulkarni. Gary Sang is our secretary. He's also outside currently. And finally, our newest e-board member is our One Health Day liaison, Abby Borzizek. So One Health really focuses on a multidisciplinary approach to achieving optimal health of humans, animals, and the environment, and that's sort of the mission statement. Under the One Health umbrella, it's believed that human health, animal health, and ecosystem health are all intertwined, and where one is affected, all others are also impacted in some way. So promoting, improving, and defending the health of all species is really the One Health initiative. And we do not believe that this can be achieved without combined efforts of physicians, veterinarians, and all other scientific and health professionals. So what is the scope of One Health? Well, as you can see here, it pretty much encompasses everything you can think of related to health. Environmental health, ecology, veterinary medicine, public health, human medicine, molecular and microbiology, health economics, starting from the individual level, yet reaching the population and ecosystem levels, issues ranging from infections and viral threats, sanitation and surveillance, environmental hazards and exposures, and even the human-animal bond. The scope of One Health is pretty much endless. Educating and creating networks to improve health outcomes for all species and the environment is the One Health initiative, and this is achieved through a collaborative global One Health approach. So the One Health platform is comprised of a strategic forum of stakeholders and a One Health reference network that come together with a common goal of enhancing the understanding of and preparedness for the current and future outbreaks of zoonoses, emerging infectious diseases in humans and animals, and antimicrobial resistance. This includes the ecological and environmental factors which impact on these diseases. And in our first panel discussion today, we will actually be talking about bringing stakeholders to the table and what all of that entails. So these goals are obviously not goals that you've never heard of before. It may just be that you haven't heard of them under the term One Health, and that's really what we want to call attention to and bring awareness of. With that, One Health has gotten the World Bank on board with their mission, and they even released a statement on One Health. And the One Health operational framework for strengthening human, animal, and environmental public health systems at their interface. And actually, Richard, who's sitting in the back there, he handed me this book from the World Bank. So if anyone's interested in looking through this, I will leave this up here for anyone. Connection to the United Nations is inevitable, as all of the goals of the UN can easily be transferred to One Health approaches. We focus on affordable and clean energy, reduced inequalities, food insecurity, life on land, life in the sea. So there's really a strong connection to the UN with One Health as well. For today's panel, we'll be discussing natural disasters under a One Health approach. In other words, how natural disasters affect humans, animals, and the environment. Climate change is one of the first topics that should come to mind when the term natural disaster is brought up. especially now more than ever. So we think about the Paris Climate Conference and the Montreal Protocol and all of these things that we're trying to put into place to reduce climate change and how that may be effective, how it might not be. The number of tropical storms and hurricanes in the past couple of years have been pretty high in number and intensity, and this also applies to droughts, heat waves, floods, sea levels, all types of natural disasters. So climate change, of course, affects natural disasters, but the point is that natural disasters affect everyone, no matter where you might live. This affects human health, and this really appeals to people on an individual level. You think about satellites detecting not just harmful algal blooms, but viruses, and a lot of people don't think about NASA doing such work, but it's all under sort of this One Health umbrella. So once people realize that the course of natural disasters is affecting them through things like food security and stability, then they get interested, they listen, they care, and they want to get involved and do more to cause change. So this is what appeals to people on a personal level. So being a part of One Health is not as complex as it may seem. It's as easy as reaching out to a multitude of disciplines to solve a problem, even at your local community. Collaborating with people who have a diverse array of expertise is really the key to One Health and to solving the issues we're faced with on a daily basis. Whether you're part of public health, medicine, veterinary science, biology, chemistry, environmental science, whatever it may be, reach out to policymakers on all levels and talk to them about One Health. The best way to get people to listen is by telling a story, something that people can relate to, and this is really what we think is the catalyst for awareness and for change. Small steps make a big difference. Don't be afraid to start at home and work your way up to the community and beyond. And in 2016 alone, there were 165 One Health Day events. And by the way, this took place on the inaugural One Health Day, November 3rd, 2016. So with that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dennis Carroll of USAID. Dr. Carroll currently oversees the agency's implementation of Emerging Threats Program in more than 30 countries across Africa and Asia. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Young Ronald.
Good morning.
Yeah.
You rock.
It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just get this slide deck up for you. And it's a particular pleasure to be here, because when we talk about the challenges that you are laying out, these are challenges about the future. And fundamentally, they're challenges that the students at GW are going to be central to either solving or not. And so you're going to be defined, your whole career is going to be defined, it's going to be defined by the events and the dynamics and trends that are going to play themselves out over the course of the next half century, the rest of the century. And those trends are predictable. We have insight. You laid out a number of these dramatic changes that are occurring with respect to climate. Inherently, these multi-sectoral challenges, because we see that whether you're talking about health, whether you're talking about environmental health, whether you're talking about human or animal health, climate, all of these are so interconnected that the way we've approached these problems in the past has been very singular in focus, and so we've stovepiped and we've isolated, and as such we've sort of aggravated the trends and the dynamics that have played themselves out. What I'm going to ask you to do is a little future think, because the future I'm going to talk about is your future, and it's the future that you have a challenge to impact on. So I'm going to talk about, it's not a very dynamic title, but behind this title is a very dynamic series of events that really speak to some of the cornerstones that will challenge your career as you go forward. And inherently, if you're going to minimize the impact of these challenges, it's going to have to come by way of a One Health approach. So, let's just start with a couple of take-home points first. 21st century. This is your century. And it's projected to be a period of unprecedented growth, both for the demand for and the production of animal protein. And this will be significant as we think about what that will translate into. But it's largely driven by an unprecedented growth in human population and dramatic increases in household wealth around the world. Population and wealth are driving dramatic changes around the world. And so with that increased demand for animal protein, come increased risks from zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. They aren't necessary consequences of the demand and production of animal protein, but if you don't pay attention, you will be exacerbating issues around the emergence of new infectious diseases and further reduction of our ability to manage bacterial infections. And if we are in fact going to better protect the world as we go forward, it's not a matter of continuing to do what we've done. You really have to think transformationally. And One Health, if we really drink the Kool-Aid around One Health, it really is fundamentally a transformational way of thinking about problems and ultimately thinking about solutions. So I'm going to challenge you to be transformational. And there's good examples of transformational thinking that we all are now experiencing. Clearly, Elon Musk has rewritten the playbook when it comes to a whole number of different ventures that are out there, and they're going to play themselves out in really profound ways. If we were having a discussion 10 years ago about what the future of space exploration looked like, or how we were going to be talking about future mobile travel on planet Earth, none of that would have taken into account the events that Elon Musk has put on the table and transformed everything around those two spaces. And it's because he's a transformational thinker. Opportunity for you is to sort of also think transformation, not just how do you keep doing better what's been done, how do you think completely out of the box and think about new solutions for these new problems. So this is a talk about zoonosis and AMR, and they're just two of the sort of risky issues that you laid out in your presentation a moment ago that have to do with One Health. But we're going to focus on zoonosis and AMR for a moment. And just to make sure people understand what zoonosis is, it's basically those diseases that have their, human diseases that have their origin, the microbes, circulate in wildlife, domestic animals, and spill over into people. They are inherently microbes that are resident in animals, evolve, and have a chance to jump into people. And obviously, antimicrobial resistance speaks to the underlying trends having to do with the acquisition of resistance by bacteria against many of the antimicrobial agents that we have. So, let's talk about the drivers behind zoonosis and AMR. First, if we think about zoonosis, there's been some very good work over the last decade which helps us to better understand what fundamentally is behind new emergent infectious diseases. And what we know that the single biggest predictor, population pressures. And that should be no surprise, because when we talk about the risk from zoonosis, we have greater risk today than we've ever had before. And if we were here in GW in 1918, the year of the great pandemic, there were 1.8 billion people on this planet. Think about that for a moment. 1.8 billion. As a species, we've been around for 400,000 years. It took us 400,000 years, plus or minus, a couple of centuries, to hit the 1 billion mark. Since 1918 to 2018, we've added another 6 billion people. Just 3 generations, 6 billion people. By the time we get to the end of this century, there's going to be 12 billion people. You can't have that kind of disruptive effect on the planet without changing the dynamics of how our species interacts with the environment in all aspects of the environment, many of the issues that you were raising in your presentation, but dramatic changes in the way we interact with wildlife and the way our livestock, by virtue of their providing us with essential animal protein, also interact with wildlife. The world today is fundamentally different than 100 years ago. Don't think about the world you're occupying bears any resemblance to the past. And the world that you'll occupy, your children will occupy in the future, are going to be fundamentally different than the world you live in today. So don't think about the future as if it's the past. This is the key to transformational thinking. Understand that the future you're dealing with requires a fundamental change in the way you think about problems. The other big predictor in terms of zoonotic diseases is mammalian diversity. Where mammalian diversity is richest and deepest on this planet think of it as a proxy for viral diversity. And that is where you'll find the greatest risk of disease emergence. And then the last has to do with habitat change. We talked about climate change. Habitat change is a major predictor because it signals the disruptive interactive effects that people are having on the ecosystem and how animals are displaced and people move in to geographic areas they've never been in before. So these are the 3 biggest drivers behind AMR: population, mammalian diversity, and habitat change. We're going to come back to that in a moment, a little more detail. And then in terms of AMR, up till a few years ago, the AMR story was really largely consigned to the right side of this figure, really speaking to the prescriber-user manufacturing practices around antimicrobial agents, whether they're antibacterials, antimalarials, antivirals. It was always about how we use them, how we abuse them in terms of our own clinical care practices. But more recently, we've begun to understand that that's really only one part of the story that is driving antibiotic resistance forward. And the big black hole that we have very little visibility on is what is going on in the livestock industry, in aquaculture. In the United States, 90% of antibiotics that are consigned for human use are in fact used by weight in the animal health sector. And to think that we can solve the problem of the pressures that drive antibiotic resistance by singularly focusing on human prescriber practices and neglect with the events that are occurring on in the livestock aquaculture domain is foolish. So when we think about AMR, we have to think about this again from a One Health perspective, the interactive pressures about our failed stewardship and how we use this. Doesn't matter what species. The bacteria are species agnostic. They're just looking for a nice ecologic niche to survive, to thrive, and to replicate. Whether they're in Homo sapiens or they're in a pig, makes no difference to them. We have to be as resilient in our thinking as bacteria are in terms of their ecologic acquisitions. So let's go back to these big drivers and let's talk about population growth. What I'm going to show you is one of these dynamic maps that reflects global population changes over time. And this is going to go from 1950 to 2100. And I'll let it run several times, but look what should come as no surprise. When we've talked about the threat of new emergent diseases over the last half century, they've largely come from Asia. Look at the map, and you'll see what's happening in Asia from 1950 up to 2000. But then, from 2000 on, Asia begins to take a different profile, and other regions of the world become the big, giant drivers of population growth. And I might add, where you'll see that population growth for the 21st century is absolutely convergent, where we have the greatest mammalian biodiversity. So let's watch this map. There's a little bar down here that just clicks up time. But watch the map. Look at Asia, look at Africa. And you'll see by the time we get to 2000, we're looking at Africa becoming a much more dominant force in terms of future population growth. When I said between 1918 and 2018, we had a 6 billion population increase. Most of that was in Asia, between India and between China. But when we go from 7 billion to 12 billion, most of that now will happen in sub-Saharan Africa. The world is a different place as we move forward. And when we think about sub-Saharan Africa, the thing we have to understand is the mammalian diversity is extraordinarily diverse, and as an extension, the viral diversity is extraordinarily diverse. So if the two of the biggest drivers are population change and mammalian diversity, the 21st century, from an infectious disease perspective, is all about sub-Saharan Africa. You can predict it, you can know it. The thing is, what do you do about it? With that population change, however, we will also see a surge in household wealth. And this is really quite remarkable, because what we know about from past economic wealth acquisition dynamics, in poor countries, one of the very first indices of having new wealth is increased demand for animal protein. That moving off of grains and tubers and onto animal protein, as it now becomes economically feasible, is an enormously transformational process. And so when we look at the world going into the 21st century, and we ask, think about where those maps talk about the largest population growth. What we're seeing is sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia over the course of this next quarter century are going to be the biggest geographic areas for economic growth. Africa, at the beginning of this century, had 1 billion people. About half of them, a little less than half of them, were urban. By the time we get to 2050, there'll be 2 billion people. 1 billion of them will be urban, and 1 billion of them will be middle class, with all of the purchasing power of middle class. So we've got two dynamics going on here. Not only are we seeing a surge in population growth, but we're seeing a surge in economic wealth, and that will translate into a demand for and a need for more production of protein. How is that going to happen? What are the implications? And what we see is that when we look at eggs, poultry, pork, mutton, beef, and milk, and look at it over the course of the next half century, what we're seeing is that sub-Saharan Africa, India, Brazil, and China are the biggest increasers in demand and production of animal protein. And in particular, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, which is the one that's at the 843%, you don't have production of animal products without a dramatic change in habitat. Because not only is it about producing animals, it's about feeding animals. And so the agriculture dynamics that will occur in sub-Saharan Africa and all of the associated habitat changes are going to be profound. And when we talk about what that might look like, when we talk about that dramatic increase in animal production, there's a double-edged sword about this. One, there'll be a dramatic increase. But what we do know is that we're going to be moving more from a mom and pop, sort of backyard, smallholder household production systems. To be able to meet that demand, we'll go to what's called intensified stuff. Joe knows all about it. But it is essentially industrial level production. And what we can see is that as we look at just a series of examples here of China, Egypt, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that as we look out over 2010 out through 2050 and understanding what their production dynamics might look like, we'll see as they'll be moving further down this curve, the lower part indicating intensifying, moving from mom and pop, smallholder, to large scale. Think of Frank Perdue level production. So these are a series of events. By the time we get out to 2050, we're going to be looking at that dramatic increase in production in response to that demand being driven in the direction of intensified livestock production. On the one hand, it's good news, but it's also a double-edged sword. When we think about zoonosis, moving from smallholder backyard farms, as all of us who have worked in this field over the last 20 years know, trying to get backyard farmers to apply what are good standards in terms of low risk, protect the flock or protect the pigs from viruses is an enormously challenging enterprise. It's when you move to these big industrial grade that it becomes a simpler way of managing that production. And so what we do know is that moving to intensified large-scale production creates an opportunity for a greater opportunity for more and more of that production to occur in environments for those animals which lower the risk of zoonosis. Zoonosis is driven in terms of livestock production with the opportunity, think of avian influenza, where from wild birds that have a natural influenza virus that will spill over into livestock. Think of poultry. And poultry then will spread that virus dramatically across poultry flocks. That will happen under poor biosecurity measures, where it's easy for people and viruses to move on and off the farm. When you begin moving to these high intensified farming practices, they have what are called very high biosecurity measures, which really protect those flocks from the introduction of any viruses that are outside the flock. So it becomes more and more of an organizational structure that minimizes the risk of future zoonosis. So that's the good news. On the less good news, though, is that intensified farming can also foster expanded use of antibiotics. That when you have animals in that high level of concentration, even if you take away one of the major uses of antibiotics in livestock production is growth promotion. But therapeutic use and prophylactic use is also a major purpose. And when you begin moving large numbers of animals into highly confined environments, the potential for them to become exposed and infected requires an enormous amount of antibiotics if it's not properly, if you don't have good hygiene and good strategies for providing therapeutic preventive measures in terms of infection. So on the one hand, this intensified farming over the course of the next half century is going to potentially play itself out in ways that will favor the minimalization of zoonosis. Think of Africa again, where the risks of zoonosis are going to be extraordinarily profound given the incredible biodiversity, viral and mammalian, and the extraordinary increase in the amount of livestock production that's going to occur. But you then run the risk of further exacerbating misuse of antibiotics, which puts us on the edge of sort of a post-antibiotic world, which means virtually many of the infections that you get this time of the year that are resolved by a proper antibiotic treatment course will no longer be effective, and we will be moving back to a 1918 type scenario where infections like influenza will no longer be able to be treated with antivirals or antibiotics. And just to give you an example, that when we think about the increased production and the intensification, we're looking by 2030 just a 67% increase in antibiotic use around the world. Where there is already excessive amounts of antibiotic use, we're looking on top of that an additional 67%. This is the world you're going to occupy if these numbers don't change. And if these numbers stay as they are, then the world you're going to be occupying is one that is going to have even more risk associated with diseases and your inability to manage those diseases effectively. But these are not inherent consequences of any of what I've talked about. These are accidental or unintended consequences. Poor management of antibiotics, poor management of zoonotic diseases are an unintended consequence driven by production processes and marketing processes which don't necessarily apply the best practices. The question is, we can apply the best practices and you can reduce the risk of zoonosis and you can reduce the risk of antibiotics, but it requires doing the work the right way. And it means that there needs to be leadership out there that really transforms the way the surge in dynamics around production and consumption are dealt with. So obviously there are a number of solutions, but I'm going to put a few of them out. You can regulate by putting a cap on antimicrobials. That would help, in livestock production, and that would have some impact on antibiotic resistance. But we know regulations are a mixed bag, particularly in many of the countries that we're talking about this huge surge in production, which tend to be very poorly regulated. They have infrastructure which makes them very vulnerable to poor regulatory practices. You could levy user fees. Both of these are sort of negative incentives, right? And we know that negative incentives, one way or another, ultimately promote black market kind of practices. So maybe, these are options, but are they the best options? We can incentivize biosecurity in terms of how animals are raised, and you can incentivize them by creating in sort of trade regulations, requirements for certain practices to have been adopted and validated in how these animals were raised before you could trade them. Let me give you an example. Thailand, in 2003, Southeast Asia at large was inundated with the H5N1 virus. And by 2005, it was broadly across Southeast Asia and it now moved out to the rest of the world. Virtually every country in Southeast Asia adopted a policy and a practice of vaccinating their poultry flock against the H5N1 virus. Every country that has done that continues to have H5N1 virus circulating within their poultry. They've controlled the outbreaks, but they've not eliminated the virus. And in fact, the vaccination has triggered the evolution of new viral clades, all of speak to different epidemiologic profiles. So in some way, we're playing a very dangerous game because there are new variants of H5N1 circulating in Southeast Asia that have moved closer and closer to that genetic profile that speaks to high transmissibility. So vaccination in this case leaves you vulnerable to long-term consequences. One country in the region, however, that basically had incentivized its biosecurity was Thailand. Thailand did not adopt a practice of vaccination of poultry. The reason was that 5% of their GNP came from exporting poultry to the European Union. And the European Union made it very clear they would not accept any poultry from Thailand if it were vaccinated, because you can get vaccinated chickens that are no longer adversely affected by H5N1, but it doesn't mean they aren't carrying H5N1. They can be subclinical, and by the time they would get to Europe, they can still shed the virus and infect flocks in Europe. So the European Union said, we will not accept any poultry that have been vaccinated. So what did Thailand do? They incentivized the entire industry to upgrade their biosecurity measures to protect their flocks from any possibility of H5N1 virus infecting their flocks. This is 15 years later. Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar all have persistent outbreaks of H5N1. Thailand has not had an outbreak of H5N1 since 2006. So you can incentivize. You can also exploit genetic potential. That is, you can make animals more disease resistant. You can exploit some of the genetic properties. You can accelerate the rate at which they grow so that the life cycle makes them less vulnerable to exposures over time. So there are many genetic tricks that you can do. But again, all of that requires some imaginative thinking. And you can also capitalize on shifts in consumer preference for modern lifestyle. You see a lot of popular press now begins looking at fast food chains to determine who has antibiotic-free chickens or meat. And so there was a ranking just last week that ranked all of the fast food providers in the United States. And that's a consumer-driven agenda. But we also know that in places like China, which is, again, sort of for influenzas, the cauldron for all influenza risks that we deal with on this planet. And it's largely driven by cultural practices that move chickens into markets, live bird markets, and the preference for the consumer to go in, identify their live bird, and then take it home and slaughter it. Well, the younger people are spending way too much time on their iPhones to want to go into a market. They much rather go to the Chinese equivalent of a KFC. So we're finding a generational shift away from live bird markets into consumer practices that protect against these types of issues. Now, within school public health, you have to recognize there are other consequences to those lifestyle diseases that may, or conditions that may be exacerbated. But there are shifts in consumer preference that you can rely on. And then, let me just, I'm a vegetarian. I'm not putting this up because I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian about 50-some years. But reduced meat consumption worldwide. When we talk about those populations of people moving from poverty into some measure of wealth, demanding access to better nutrition, that better nutrition does not necessarily have to be animal protein. And the question is whether or not we can begin a shift in how we culturally identify the source of our protein. And I'm going to give you another map, and it's a map that speaks to the global disparity in meat consumption around the world today. And you can see North America, Europe, for instance, meat consumption above average is absolutely astounding. If you go to the two regions where we look at the biggest economic growth, and in the case of Africa, the population growth over the course of this century, think about it. If the lifestyle that we adopt up here now becomes the standard lifestyle as they move into purchasing power, middle class, or as India moves in, are they supposed to mimic our lifestyle? If they do, you talk about having an impact on the planet Earth, we will be nothing short of a global disaster, because you can't have, in this case, 12 billion people consuming animal protein with the type of vigor that occurs within North America and Europe. In some way, we have established a high bar for poor performance. And it reflects, it's sort of like, we recognize that as consumers of energy, we are excessive with respect to the wastefulness with the way we consume energy. And so there's more and more effort to create greater efficiencies in that energy consumption and lower the need for more energy consumption, because we know it's non-sustainable, and the rest of the world can't treat energy with the same cavalier approaches that we have in the past. That's a recognized area of ongoing global investment to try and figure out better energy consumption. But we need to also think about, during the course of your careers, how are populations in Africa and India going to be able to translate their need for and rightful access to good food security, good protein, and good lifestyles? You're going to have to figure that out one way or the other. We go back to that issue about transformation. It is not simply about continuing to do what we've done and expect others to do differently. We're going to have to be transformative in how we live our lives, how we sort of set standards and examples, because as these countries come on board in 2050, the consequences could be disastrous. So it's certainly a concern. The challenges are there. The solutions aren't. But we need to be transformative, and you need to come up with really good, clever solutions. So back to Elon Musk. For as challenging as this is, it's important that we don't panic. These are solvable, resolvable challenges. They're ones that will only be solved or resolved within a One Health paradigm, because we're essentially talking about a multi-sectoral problem that requires multi-sectoral solutions. So if you are a student of public health, that public needs to be a much bigger P than what we've traditionally used it as. And that public has to be a chapeau that includes human, animal, and environmental. And part of that transformational thinking and action is embracing that fundamental difference. So as you move forward, don't panic, but opportunities for solutions are there. None of these are inevitable. They're all predictable, and they're all avoidable. It's entirely up to the choices and decisions that are made over the course of the next several decades. What's the world going to look like? I would put my money on an Elon Musk approach rather than doing the same thing again. Albert Einstein famously noted that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of madness. Don't embrace the solutions that previous generations have offered, because they're not working. Follow Albert Einstein's insight. New solutions are required if the solutions are going to solve the problem. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. So now I would like to briefly introduce our first four panelists, and as I introduce you all, you can go ahead and step to the front and have a seat. Dr. Ronald Waldman. Dr. Ronald
That was a
Waldman.
good-looking guy you had.
We'll go back to that, don't worry. Dr. Ronald Waldman began as a volunteer at the WHO Global Smallpox Eradication Program in Bangladesh, and then joined the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 1979. He's currently professor of global health at our very own Milken, and he is chairman of the board of directors of Doctors of the World. Would you like to come up and have a seat?
Not really.
Ricardo Eshlar is a senior public health advisor within the USAID Emerging Threats Division. He works closely with the U.S. Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance on agency-wide infectious disease and pandemic preparedness and response efforts, and with the U.S. CDC's Office of One Health. Okay.
I'm here to stand in for Rob.
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
from
That's fine. Thank you for coming.
You look like Robert.
We'll pretend that we're the same person today.
And so Robert is not here today, but, and what is
He's
your
here. Sure, sorry, I'll introduce myself. I'm Katie Terradis. I'm the director of the Preparedness and Response Project funded by USAID. Rob and I are colleagues.
Okay.
He was just not feeling well this morning, so called me and asked if I could stand in his place. But I work on the same preparedness and response.
Well, we're glad to have you
Thank
here.
you so
Thank
much.
you for
Sorry
coming.
for the last minute change.
That's okay. I'll just still give a bit of information on Robert so you know. He's a global health and development practitioner who served as technical manager for the Urban Gardens program for HIV-affected women and children in Ethiopia. He has performed assignments in more than 20 countries across Southeast Asia, East and Central Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And finally, we have Anne Goldman. Anne Goldman is an instructor here at Milken, and she co-directs the practicum and field laboratory experience courses for the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. She also helps to coordinate research and educational projects in Brazil and Argentina for the GW Medical Center Department of Medicine. All right, so for our first panel, what I really want to discuss is getting stakeholders to the table. So I'll pose the first question, which is who needs to be participating in pandemic prevention, detection, and response? And anyone can sort of respond and how you see fit, and we'll just
Let's go first. All right, I'll go first. So I'm Ricardo Eshlar. As mentioned, I work with Dennis at USAID, with Ron on some work with community preparedness and with Katie on the preparedness and response project. So the topic of today is natural disasters, but this is on pandemic prevention. And I think it's important to recognize that whether it's natural disasters or about pandemic prevention, it's, and Dennis mentioned it, it's about minimizing and mitigating risk. That's the focus about it. Recognizing, we've seen time and again with natural disasters, those that prepare and put in the right resources tend to do better than others. We saw with the hurricane in Florida, everybody focused on this one beautiful house on Mexico Beach that withstood these ridiculous winds. You saw it in Bandeache with the mosques that continued to stand after the tsunami, and everyone realized, well, you know, the mosque stood because you don't want to shortchange God a lot, and you wanted to create things that could withstand any type of element. So those are the types of things in terms of thinking about getting stakeholders to the table. In terms of One Health, the work that we've been doing at USAID and through the Preparedness and Response Project, it was focusing on bringing these One Health stakeholders through the various ministries. And I think I think the first question is, why do we want to get the stakeholders to the table? And this is something that Ron will talk about a lot. It really starts out on who can you call when there is an event. You need to establish those relationships before something actually happens. And you need to know who and when and where. You have to have that all in place, and that's why we want to get that established before the next epidemic or natural disaster. But then you have to think about getting the right stakeholders at the table. In One Health, you've got a lot of expertise, especially at the technical level, and that's excellent. You have the right people. The problem is getting the right resources, especially money, and planning. So how do we get those people who recognize that what One Health provides is it's beneficial to the wider cause. It brings together various ministries and actors to address these risks. And most importantly, how do we keep them at the table? That's very difficult. We saw after the 2009 pandemic, a lot of the efforts that were happening for pandemic preparedness sort of dropped off. And then we are reminded with the West Africa Ebola outbreak that we need to do more to continue having people at the table and working together to better understand the prevention, detection, and response. And that's really been part of the emphasis of the global health security agenda. And then for me, I'm all about working with local partners and local solutions, because they are there before, during, and after events. Understanding that and I think you, Lisa, you had a really good comment, whether it's at the community and national and global level, it starts there, right? So that's what's really important about bringing people together, knowing your neighbors, knowing your town, knowing your school of public health, and building on those relationships is really important. And I think that's where it begins in terms of prevention, detection, and response, is understanding communities, and giving them the tools, or listening to them about what are the tools they already use to address these issues. And those are my thoughts for now.
So maybe just I'll take a stab at the first issue of who needs to be participating in pandemic prevention, detection, and response. I want to maybe address more than just pandemics, as we did earlier this morning. But I want to focus my remarks on three basic groups of people. Number one, politicians. And I'm not, we have a relatively short time this morning, so I don't want to go into the whole, resource allocation and things like this. I just want to come back to Dennis's main point, that we need to engage in transformational thinking to solve these problems of the future. That's not what politicians do, at least not in this country and in most countries. Politicians tend to adopt a very short-sighted approach to problem solving. It has partly to do with the short time span of our electoral process. Every 2 years we change our entire Congress, as we're all aware, in this country. Every 6 years the entire Senate turns over. But these solutions that we're talking about need to be developed over decades and really over a century or more. And it's very difficult, I think, for countries like the US and other traditionally wealthy countries that adopt this short-sighted approach to contribute greatly in the public sector to finding these long-term solutions. And that's why the imaginative minds are found in academia, they're found in Silicon Valley, they're found in places other than government. There needs to be some convincing of our politicians that their transition from one administration to the next needs to be a lot smoother and a lot more one-directional than it has been. And we're seeing exactly the opposite now in many of the North American and Western European nations, and that does not serve us well in terms of pandemic prevention, amongst other things. I was at a dinner not so long ago, last winter I think, where Henry Kissinger was asked over his time serving in numerous administrations, what did he think was the biggest mistake that any president he had served under had made? And his answer was basically what I just said, that we're losers. We're going to end up being losers unless we can develop approach more similar to the ones that the Chinese have. Our leaders plan 4 years ahead, if they plan at all, and not just rebound from the day-to-day, what they call it, the 24-hour news cycle. But they're planning on a very short-term basis. China has a strategy for where they want to be in the world 50 years from now. And whether it's going to be through one, of course they have their internal power struggles, and people are people, so there's individuals fighting with each other for who's going to be the leader. But whoever the leader is, the direction is much more consistent, much more constant, much more developmental than ours is. So that's one group of people that need to be much, much more engaged. The second constituency I want to focus on are social scientists. Ricardo knows that I really have a thing about promoting the role of anthropologists, sociologists, and others in public health. I think that we've become, over time, regardless in spite of the progress that we've made, we've become, as public health practitioners, a little bit too insular in our thinking. We try to find epidemiological solutions to problems where epidemiology certainly has a role to play, but cannot be the be-all and end-all. And we have to bring more diversity into our problem-solving process, and that means using tools that have been developed by other disciplines. We have to be much more open to the contributions that anthropologists can make, that sociologists can make, that behavioral scientists can make. If one of Dennis's points is that we need to work on the lifestyle modification process of humans as well, through all my training in medicine and public health and my practice, I never had any teachings about how to approach that or do it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I am saying that there are disciplines out there where that is people's calling. And we need to work. We've done it in some ways. I think we've made tremendous progress in tobacco control, for example. We've done it in other areas as well. But I think when it comes to understanding the consequences of the effects of food production, of climate change, of our fisheries, of other lifestyle issues in protecting ourselves from the spread of viruses and other causes of disease, I think we need to be much more broad-minded and embrace what others have to contribute. And I'll repeat 100 times, 1,000 times the emphasis that Ricardo placed on working with communities. Fundamentally, that's what public health is about, but we need really seriously to guard ourselves against the tendency we have to want to tell communities what to do and then complain that they're not listening to us. Let me just give a prime example, one that's unfolding now, which is the Ebola outbreak in North Kivu province in Democratic Republic of Congo, where a population that's been made vulnerable for decades, living in conflict, in poverty, without access to food, a highly food insecure population, a population that has very precarious access to water and to sanitation, a population whose children are not vaccinated against routine childhood diseases so that their infant and child mortality rates are sky high, population where violence against women has been allowed to run rampant, all of this with little or no assistance, either from its own government or from international development assistance. Now they have an Ebola outbreak and people are trying to drop in there, flying in on SpaceX with Elon Musk and whatever. But there's a real sort of, you think that there's an invasion on our southern border, you should see what it's like in Kinshasa and Beni and places where there's Ebola virus. And what are we coming to give these people who haven't had food security, water and sanitation, or even basic primary health care services, and we come to offer them Ebola vaccine, and then we're upset that they won't accept it, or that they accept it only with the greatest reluctance. I think it just makes no sense whatsoever that our supplies don't match in any way, shape, or form their demand. And it's not at all acceptable for me to think that they're not listening to us when the clear evidence is that we're not listening to them at all. So we need to get over ourselves a little bit. We need to, as Dennis points out really correctly, that we need to not accept the accepted solutions, the conventional approaches to the problems we have. We need to be much more open to innovation. We need to be open to an expansion of our thinking and of our participation, and we need to take and adopt much more long-sighted approaches to the problems that we have, or we'll be finding ourselves headed in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Ricardo and Ron. I think, we're all doing a lot of the similar work in the same countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. What we've seen is when you talk about who needs to be involved, it's a lot of people. We've talked about One Health sectors being traditionally human health, animal health, and environment, and it's a lot more than that. As we talk about the effects of climate change and food security, there's a lot more than just those three sectors that need to be involved in preparedness and response efforts. And not only across these different sectors, which could include not just human, animal, environment, but also ministries of gender or youth. Different countries have different ways of addressing issues of marginalized populations and ensuring diversity in voices and representation. You also need to think about border control, security, ministries of finance, as Ricardo mentioned, talking about resource allocation. There's a lot of different sectors that need to be involved to come up with holistic solutions to the challenges that are facing us. In addition to this diversity across different technical sectors, also looking at vertical integration from national to community level. Solutions have to be local, and they have to be also integrated with the national level policy infrastructure and what the politicians are doing and what the political environment is. So looking at connecting what's happening on the ground, what works in communities, with what's happening at the national level. Really making those linkages. As you know, we talk about public health. Public health has to be a challenge that's addressed by the public sector. You can also bring in private sector actors. The private sector certainly played an important role in the Ebola response in West Africa, and can play an important role in response in other future outbreaks. But engaging them as part of a public sector driven solution and ensuring that they're filling gaps as appropriate and focusing those relationships on the preparedness side so that when an outbreak happens, they're ready to respond. I think that's an important lesson that we've identified on the preparedness and response project, trying to figure out how to convene all these different actors from horizontal linkages across the different technical sectors, and then also the vertical linkages between the national and subnational and community levels has been really interesting and important. The other point that I'd like to touch on that a lot of people have raised today, and Ron most recently, about things have to be local. The solutions have to be local, and we have to do things differently. It has to be transformational and not the same way we've been trying to do things before. So one model that we've adopted on the preparedness and response project that I think has been really interesting is when we talk about how to bring all these stakeholders together. Every country is a little bit different in terms of who the stakeholders are and who the right players are, and how do you bring them together? Who is the right person to convene them? That's another question that we want to talk about today. The way that we've managed these relationships with preparedness and response is we have a technical advisor in country who is a local, who has the relationships already with different sectors and already has technical respect from colleagues in public health, animal health, environment. Different countries have different models, but this is somebody who has been there, who knows the cultural context, who knows the key stakeholders, who knows the politicians, and knows the technical advisors in the One Health field. And this is a person who's going to stay there after the project ends. So the way that we've structured, the support from USAID under preparedness and response is a lot of the support has been remote and setting up infrastructure to provide regional and international support to benefit from cross-country learnings and best practices and global expertise, but really relying on the one person in country to be the one who's making the connections and bringing all the different stakeholders to the table as a way of ensuring that it's local and country-driven.
Well, I serve as the coordinator for the excess mortality ascertainment from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico study that GW carried out recently. And last night I gave thought to how I might make our Hurricane Maria experience more meaningful and congruent to the vision, goals, and intent and purpose of One Health. My thought is that rather than to tell you about our findings, I'll talk about our achievements, looking at them through the lens of the core functions of public health. After all, the goal of public health is to protect and promote the health and well-being of the population. In doing its job of promoting and protecting public health practice, public health practice has to address the issue of social and environmental factors that impact health. So I thought, why not? So here we go. So the core functions of public health are assessment, policy development, and evaluation. The problem that we were involved in was, amidst the flurry of controversy regarding the number of deaths associated with Hurricane Maria, the government of Puerto Rico commissioned GW to conduct a study to carry out an assessment to get a better idea of the count. But they also asked us to look at the communications and how well Puerto Rico had implemented the CDC guidelines for identifying deaths in the aftermath of a hurricane. So our mission was to carry out essentially an epidemiology research effort that had two prongs. One was the analysis of the numbers, and the other one was the system that the numbers were coming from, essentially the public death certification, registration, and classification system. And the other request was that we look at the communications between the government and the public, and within the government about mortality. So we were able to ascertain the number of deaths and that the data systems were of acceptable quality. And these were the epidemiology research studies. And they satisfy the first core function of public health. And if we broaden the lens and look at the intangible benefits that were not captured in the reports, the first thing that stands out is the difference in our presence on the island and more so in the communities, because to carry out the communications and the assessment of the public health, the health certification system, we went into the communities in different parts of the island to talk to people about their experiences and ask them about what, how the public health system, the death certification system was functioning in their areas before and after the hurricane. Through our work, we produced a series of recommendations which the government is able to use and is beginning to use in terms of policy development. And this, what's missing from this picture is the fact that we were not able to, or it was not our mission at the time, to ascertain the challenges the community and its residents face in having a meaningful participation in our efforts to promote and protect their health and well-being. And that's the next phase. What did the community face in terms of what can we learn so that they can be protected in the future? And in terms of one of the things in our recommendations in our report was about more public health, more preparedness planning, and Ron kept emphasizing the fact that it's not just having a plan, but it is working together to have it, and it means bringing everyone to the table from the government level to the community level. And I'm hoping that given some of the experiences that people had in Puerto Rico that I saw and learned about from others, is that they will also demand that participation.
Let me add, if I could, that I think Anne and her colleagues might have been a little bit surprised when they submitted their article, their manuscript regarding the death count in Puerto Rico to the Lancet, that the Lancet suggested that they publish it not in their main journal, but in a journal that they developed fairly recently called the Journal of Planetary Health, a term that was coined a few years ago by Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet. And the reason is that there's a movement underway. A few universities have now subsequently appointed professors of planetary health, and it seems to be an emerging discipline. Dennis, in his keynote address, put some emphasis on the relationship between population, people, animals, and the environment. All of those circles that we usually see in that triangular depiction we do need to be really, really expanded. It's not just the population of people that's expanding, it's not just the poultry population that's expanding, but the environmental risks, the environmental threats are expanding vastly as well. And these interactions are not adequately taken into account, really, by any of our existing disciplines. So with One Health that we're focusing on here, we're talking about bringing together veterinarians and medical practitioners for humans, disciplines that, as obvious as it might be, should have been brought together many, many, many years ago, were not brought together because of the restrictions imposed by the rigors of the discipline. Doctors don't really like to talk to anybody else, they focus on it. Veterinarians never had the resources. I don't know what the mindset might be, but they never had the resources to be able to integrate with other areas. And then when it comes to environmental factors, it's the population pressure on the planet that is really putting us at great risk with increasing numbers of both what are called natural disasters, but also of humanitarian emergencies, conflict, man-made disasters as they're sometimes called. So because the Puerto Rico event, although we looked at mortality, you looked at mortality, it's hard to get away from the fact that this came about because of a hurricane for which we were inadequately prepared. And there's a tremendous increase in these kinds of events. So I think that we should place more emphasis as well on that. I was a little bit skeptical at first of this, of the development of this discipline and the dedication of new journals to it. But I've warmed to the idea that there's something there, and that nothing that we've been studying really exists in isolation, and that we have to do a much better job at looking at the interactions as well.
Right, and when we talk about who can convene all of these people together, starting from the community and going up to the governmental level, you brought up having a technical advisor. So I'm curious, is there just one? I mean, how does that work? Because from what I heard, you said advisor. So I'm just.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll take a stab at it, and then I'm sure others have other things to add. So the way our project functions is, in most countries, it is an advisor, is one person, and what that person does is communicates with all the different sectors, and depending on the country and the context and the different audiences, there might need to be One Health sensitization activities where we talk about the importance of One Health to that sector, and we've done that in a lot of countries. We have short sort of half-day sessions, or we have like multi-day sessions where you sort of go through why a One Health approach might be important to those in academia, or those in the wildlife sector, or those who may not be as sensitized to the importance of a One Health approach. So there's different ways that this one person can make sure that there is incentives to bring folks together. And another important part about the way the Preparedness and Response Project works is, in addition to this technical advisor that we have that has connections with different technical disciplines, we also take advantage of neutral facilitation that either is local to that country or within the region, just depending on the country context. So bringing the folks together for what? For preparedness broadly, but more specifically, is it to adapt a preparedness plan for avian influenza to make sure it's more multi-sectoral? Or is it to develop a One Health strategy in the country? Or is it to do a tabletop simulation on anthrax outbreak? Or there's different reasons and outputs that you might bring people together. And depending on what you're doing, everybody comes to the table with different perspectives. Depending on which discipline you are in, you have different motivations and different incentives and different political influences and different resources. All of these different voices come together. So the way our project has worked to enable these multi-sectoral outputs in a plan, revised plan or strategy, is we have a neutral facilitator that comes in and ensures that all voices are heard. So we bring people together to talk about whatever the output is, and then we have a neutral facilitator to ensure that all the perspectives are integrated, and that we're hearing from all the different stakeholders, and really ensuring a One Health approach in the effort. So it is very lean and very light touch, and I think that is intentional and requires ownership from each of the respective ministries. So what we often see is that we don't have resources except for the one technical advisor, and then we bring in facilitators or maybe other external advisors for specific events, but it requires a lot of ownership and champions from the technical sectors that we work with. So in order for it to be sustainable, we have to have the country governments actually continue to drive it. So in terms of our role as international development partners, it is very light, but there are lots of other people involved, but they are the people that are already working on the health and the champions that exist in the country. We just support the practice of preparedness and engagement across sectors.
Yeah, I think what Kate mentioned through the Preparedness and Response Project has, and to a point she said, as she mentioned earlier, it's not one size fits all. It really is. It's listening to see how what the political context is, what the social context is, to see how you can bring the people together. And understanding that is also part about human being. And I think for the most part, our experience with these countries is, as Katie mentioned, having someone who's perceived as neutral, does not have a hidden agenda to them is really important. And we also partner with other organizations like FAO and WHO who have that mandate to these member states to come in and support them. And they've been really, including with the World Animal Health Organization, Hawaii, have really been drivers globally of the One Health movement. And Joe's part of the work with the tripartite now on the Zoonoses Guide. It's something that continues to bring the member states together and driving them forward. I think one thing, thinking about long-term transformative work that we do at USAID is also a project we have as the One Health Workforce, which is bringing together these multiple universities, faculties, schools across disciplines to help understand the value of the different disciplines. So getting to students at a younger age to understand why you need to have a multidiscipline team for outbreak response, why you need to bring in and hopefully like the social sciences anthropologists to better understand the local context. Things like that, that's thinking long term, and I think it's something that's going to pay off dividends in generations to come now that we're creating this, we're breaking down these walls across disciplines and understanding the value of one another. And so to that, for the students here, I think that's really important for you. I know in my experience in public health, I just stayed in the public health program. I didn't really go out and socialize with the other schools. I think in GW, you need to because of where you're located here in DC. You're in a school that you will have colleagues across the program in GW that will be influential leaders. So I think it's important to break down those barriers here in GW, keep those who you think will be future politicians and leaders close so that you can continue these efforts in the future.
Well, I think that to build on that, one of the things that we have to do is build capacity within the communities. And through public health, we can do that by, for instance, in the case of Puerto Rico, when we agreed on doing this project, the first thing we did was call the University of Puerto Rico. We had colleagues there. We said, we want to work with you. I think it would have been foolhardy to go in there. I know Puerto Rico fairly well. I was born and raised there. And I think it would have been foolhardy to go in there and just say, okay, we're going to do this study. And so we contacted them and we started to work with them. I didn't know them as well as some of my other colleagues did. And I discovered a wealth of knowledge and capacity. And it's through them, and I think we should promote programs with the public health department. There's a lot of work of developing capacity in the public health department, and through them, and into working with other government agencies and other sectors of society. Puerto Rico is 100 square miles. It is a very diverse island in terms of flora and fauna and insect life, and it's something that needs to be preserved. There are conservation entities, particularly the Conservation Fund, and but to bring them together, we have to build the capacity where people understand that has to be done and how it has to be done. And again, to link with the communities, and some of those groups are actually working in communities, and to have them work and demand more activities, more activity.
So I'm going to take it up from what Katie said. Like the reason to this panel is that everybody provides a really different insight to the whole concept of One Health. And based on that, I'm just going to pick out two questions directed towards an individual, but since it's multidisciplinary, everybody can contribute. So I think my first question would go to Professor Warren. I know everybody over here in school recognizes you for your contributions to the humanitarian and public health interventions, and you've usually traveled across with your expertise through Bangladesh, Pakistan, Haiti. So my point being, like, how would you justify or discuss the interplay of One Health specific to these humanitarian emergencies? And maybe directing this question to you.
Well, let me think of how to approach that. Mostly, in our focus in humanitarian emergencies so far, although things are evolving, has been on preventing excess morbidity and mortality largely from communicable diseases. Those are the things we've had problems with in public health. Whatever the cause of a particular emergency, we really see our job as being to prevent an emergency from becoming a long-term event. So setting up public health programs very early on, following the onset of an emergency, is very important. What we have not done a very good job at is understanding the causes of these emergencies, the root causes of them. Even though, there's a lot of activity, but preparedness really gets short shrift when it comes to resources that are made available. We talk a lot about a cycle of panic and neglect, so that when an event occurs, we respond. We're getting better at predicting the occurrence of these events, so our responses are getting to be a little bit more efficient and a little bit more effective. But we still haven't really taken it upon ourselves to prepare as well as we might. So that in the realm of communicable diseases, it brings us to the idea that many, if not most, of the diseases that have taken the greatest toll in humanitarian emergencies are in fact zoonotic diseases. Ebola now, because it's on all of our minds, is a case in point, but it's far from the only example that one could name. Although there's even a United Nations agency that's devoted to disaster reduction, the ISDR, their focus on health is minimal. Health has always been something, health issues are something that we respond to rather than preparing for. And we've developed very good countermeasures for their response. So we have vaccines that we could administer in times of immediate need. We have a lot of drugs that we can use to cure people when they get sick. But we still don't do as good a job as we might in understanding when the kinds of events we've been responding to might happen. So the approach in One Health terms is one that Dennis has laid out very nicely from when he first got very much involved in this, which is that the way communicable disease control works traditionally is that we don't do anything until a cluster of cases occurring in humans gets large enough for us to be able to detect it. Case in point, HIV/AIDS. Where did we learn about HIV/AIDS? We learned about it from a cluster of cases of Kaposi's sarcoma in New York City and a cluster of cases of pneumocystis caridii pneumonia in Los Angeles. Do you think that HIV/AIDS began in New York City and in Los Angeles? Absolutely not. Do you think it began in 1980? Absolutely not. In fact, we know that the virus entered the human population from a simian population in the 1920s. From 1920 to 1980, we did nothing because we're not very interested in doing surveillance in many areas of the world where these diseases emerge. And we were never very interested in doing any kind of surveillance at all in species other than our own. So we allowed a disease that caused a pandemic as serious as HIV/AIDS to fester for more than 50 years in populations outside of the United States and in species outside of the human species, and we reap the consequences. Do you think it's impossible now, 50 years, 60 years, 90 years later? Do you think it's impossible that there's another pathogen out there circulating either in the animal population or even in the human population that we don't know about, that we could one day learn about, and that could have consequences as great or greater than those of HIV/AIDS? If your answer is no, you fail. Because of course it's possible that that's happening. We haven't done a good enough job of moving our surveillance systems to the left, to being able to detect diseases from seeing a clump of cases in humans to being able to detect potential pathogens in humans before they affect us in the animal species. So that's a lot of the work that Dennis and his colleagues at USAID and their partners outside of the government have been doing for the last 10 years or so. It probably, recently they've had a kind of proof of concept success in being able to identify a new species of Ebola virus in animals before it's been detected in humans. That's the direction in which we have to move our epidemiological work. And I want to bring it full circle and say only that if we can do that and be better at detection and prevention prior to the occurrence of the humanitarian emergencies that I have focused on in most of my career, we'll have a much, much easier time, first of all, of responding, and second of all, to maybe being able to respond less frequently as well. But the way we work, and maybe we need some social scientists to modify our own behavior, all of us, because the way we work is to get very excited when we find something and to do nothing about it before we find it. The cycle of panic and neglect that continues to be perpetrated. And a lot of people are working on, trying to change things. There's obviously a lot of work going on in Ebola. There's even a little bit of work going on in terms of looking at other potentially important, potentially epidemic or even pandemic pathogens. But I don't think it's really enough, and we've certainly not enough work going on in the endemic diseases like malaria, tuberculosis that we have that always complicate humanitarian emergencies. And somehow we have to change that paradigm, I think, by by engaging the politicians and other constituencies that I mentioned earlier. But there was one constituency that I did not mention earlier, which is the one we really have to work on a lot more, I see, and that's the student constituency. We have to get a lot more. This room should be filled with people not only from this school, as Ricardo said, but by students from across the university whose work is related to public health and maybe even important or more important than the work we in public health do in some way. But we need demographers who would have been really useful, sociologists mentioned, we need economists, lawyers. I went to law school, especially lawyers, although we don't want to get too close to them. Geographers. I mean, I can go on and on and on. And I think we really do need to start to do something to make sure that the university adopts more of a planetary health approach, of which One Health is an important part of the whole.
I'm going to add one thing to that. I think what Ron said was excellent. So USAID has the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and now they do have a One Health advisor on their team, which is excellent. It's really important now. She's a veterinarian, and recognizing that there are One Health components to these emergencies and humanitarian issues. So, especially as it deals with famine and drought, and forced migration, and refugee settings, you need to remember about the animals in those contexts. And it's important for the populations, but it's also important recognizing the interconnection between the different disciplines. So it's very small. Hopefully it will expand. I think it's important. I think, and there's something about Ebola in particular, because when you have an outbreak of like a foodborne disease, you quickly identify the source of it. But with Ebola, there's something about not being able to really trace back where the source was. And not this outbreak, but the last outbreak, we wanted to take the opportunity to see if we can do some studies to better determine what was the origin of the spillover that resulted in the outbreak in Ecuador. And it's just something that's very difficult to do. And I think it's not impossible, and I think it's something that we need to think about how we can do that, because you're not going to minimize risk unless you know exactly where it started and how it started. And if there's certain conditions or factors that continue to drive it. I seem to keep plugging things, but one project that was also done from the West Africa Ebola outbreak was the Ebola host study, which was a really excellent. It's still ongoing, but understanding how if possible, the Ebola virus, where it's circulating, if it's continuing to circulate in animal populations in the affected area. Because Ebola didn't just show up, it's there. We knew from previous work, there's lots of loss of fever. And we've seen in other studies, there's antibodies to Ebola in the region. But now trying to get a better forward thinking of the actual virus in the region. And because of that, they were able to discover a new Ebola virus before it caused any illness in humans, and that's the Lumbali virus, which is pretty groundbreaking to be able to identify a new Ebola virus before it actually results in any illness. Those are the types of things you want to do. We know there's a lot we know we're at risk at, but it's very important to keep thinking about what may be coming down the pipeline for us in the future. And also, one thing I want to reiterate, and something that I didn't think about in public health until I started working in the space, is that a lot of the arrows, when you look at the graphs, always end at the human populations. It never goes back to the animals. There's a lot to be said there. We can't forget about the animals, not just because they're our pets and they're so beautiful and everything, but it is part of that planetary One Health movement, is that we are all interconnected. And a recent article in Science in Brazil showed that the Zika virus was identified in dead monkeys. So that could be a potentially groundbreaking discovery, knowing that there's now Sylvatic cycle to Zika and it can perpetuate the disease in the region. And we've seen it with yellow fever as well. We always have to consider these factors and we can't fall back on what we've known.
Zika is another example, like HIV, of a virus that was first identified in 1947. And now we discover it and get excited about it when there are a bunch of cases in humans. How many years ago was that? Oh, I know, because so, it's just the same thing all over again. It's just remarkable that the same is true for this outbreak in North Kivu of Ebola. We have no idea even what the index case in humans is, because we don't identify things when one case occurs. We need a mass to accumulate before we identify it. So this outbreak and the last one, and although the West Africa outbreak is said to have originated with a 2-year-old boy in Meliandu, Guinea, I think that's really folklore. And I think that we had the journalist who did that report in Vogue magazine, Vanity Fair, at a class a few years ago, and he said he really has no clue. He said he only writes what people tell him, which is true. So, it's we really have to do a lot better of moving all of our surveillance work, our prevention work, our preparedness work, much more to the left of the spectrum if we're going to bring some balance and equilibrium to One Health in regard to humanitarian emergency.
Can I add one just very quick comment? First of all, I just want to say, Ron, you make my heart sing because my degree is in anthropology and not in public health, so yay, anthropologist.
I'm an anthropologist friend.
And just the other very quick point I wanted to make, a colleague of mine recently made the analogy that really resonated with me, and so I'm going to share it because it might resonate with others too. When we talk about preparedness and focusing on preparedness and not just response, but really looking at how we better prepare for these diseases, think about the military and military readiness and making that analogy between how much time the military spends getting ready for war and how much time they actually spend in battle. They spend all their time getting ready, and we should take that lesson, I think, when we think about preparedness. We should spend all our time getting ready, and only a small portion